Good afternoon, I'm Trina Jones, and on behalf of the Black Law Students Association and the Duke Law Center on Law, Race, and Politics, I would like to thank all of you for attending today's event. Liz Wango, who has done an absolutely wonderful job in organizing this discussion, asked that I begin with the following video.
Hansberry, Brooklyn, New York, unarmed. November 25th, 2006, Sean Bell, Queens, New York, unarmed. January 1, 2009, Oscar Grant, Oakland, California, unarmed. January 29th, 2010, Aaron Campbell, Portland, Oregon, unarmed. July 18th, 2011, Alonzo Ashley, Denver, Colorado, unarmed. March 7th, 2012, Wendell Allen, New Orleans, Louisiana, unarmed. September 14th, 2013, Jonathan Farrell, Charlotte, North Carolina, unarmed. July 17th, 2014, Eric Garner, Staten Island, New York, unarmed. August 9th, 2014, Michael Brown, Ferguson, Missouri, unarmed. In the past decade alone, these men and hundreds of others have lost their lives to police. Local police report to the FBI killing at least 400 people a year. From 2006 to 2012, a white police officer killed a black person at least twice a week in this country. Which brings us back to Ferguson, Missouri, where, according to a report in the Daily Beast, in 2009, police officers charged a man for property damage because he bled on their uniforms while they arrested him and allegedly beat him bloody. Ferguson, Missouri, where it took 6 days to release the name of an officer who shot an unarmed teenager to death. Ferguson, Missouri, where police released images of someone who might be Michael Brown involved in a store robbery, and then hours later said the robbery had nothing to do with why Michael Brown was stopped by the police officer who killed him. Ferguson is just outside St. Louis, Missouri, the place where, as historian Blair Kelly reminded us this week in The Root, Dred Scott sued for his freedom on the grounds that he and his wife had for many years lived in a free state. His case eventually went to the Supreme Court, and in 1857, Chief Justice Roger Taney declared that Scott had no right to sue because, as a black man, he was never intended to be an American. Speaking on the clause in the Declaration of Independence that all men are created equal, Taney wrote, quote, "It is too clear for dispute that the enslaved African race were not intended to be included and formed no part of the people who framed and adopted this declaration." Taney went on to say that black men had no rights which the white man was bound to respect. No rights which the white man was bound to respect. No rights which the white man was bound to respect. No rights which the white man was.
In the aftermath of Mike Brown's death, opinion polls demonstrated that black and white Americans were sharply divided over the role of race in the shooting. A HuffPost YouGov.com poll showed that among black respondents, 76% said that the shooting was part of a broader pattern in the way that police treat black men, while only 35% of white respondents agreed. A Pew Research Center poll produced similar findings. There, 80% of black respondents, but only 37% of white respondents said that the case raised important questions about race. Both surveys also found a significant racial divide in how Americans expect the investigation of Darren Wilson to proceed. The HuffPost YouGov.com poll found that 49% of black respondents, but only 28% of white respondents expect the officer's punishment to be too lenient. In the Pew survey, 52% of whites, but only 18% of blacks said they have a great deal or a fair amount of confidence in the investigation of Brown's death. Similar differences existed in the aftermath of George Zimmerman's acquittal following the death of Trayvon Martin, with Black Americans being far more likely than white Americans to believe that race played a role in the shooting and the subsequent prosecution and acquittal. Now, many factors no doubt influence these different perspectives. I would suggest to you, as did Professor Harris Perry, that an important variable may be our respective understandings of the role of race in U.S. history. In an article in The Guardian following the death of Mike Brown, Michael Waters observes that the killing of unarmed Black men by law enforcement officers is deeply embedded in the racial fabric of our nation. He goes on to discuss what he calls the expendable Black body. He notes, and I quote, "Historically, in the United States, Black bodies have been considered expendable and easily replaceable. Tens of millions of Africans were brought to this nation as slaves because Black life was considered expendable. If an African became gravely ill or died while on forced voyage to the New World, they were just thrown into the sea. Other Black bodies would substitute for any losses in future voyages. During American slavery, Black babies and children were used as bait to lure alligators from the swamps for capture. This sometimes resulted in the maiming or death of these Black children because Black life was considered expendable. The United States Public Health Service used Black men to test the impact of untreated syphilis from 1932 to 1972, resulting in the death of many Black men and in the infection of their partners because Black life was considered expendable. Environmental racism places the urban poor near landfills and factories that cause increased rates of cancer and other diseases because Black and even poor lives are considered expendable. Levees in New Orleans were poorly maintained and constructed near poor Black communities, resulting in massive flooding after Hurricane Katrina because Black lives are considered expendable. Blacks receive harsher penalties for the same crimes, and the disproportionate rate of Black imprisonment may actually encourage white support of racially driven tactics such as stop and frisk because Black lives are considered expendable." End quote. It's against this historic backdrop and with an awareness of the expendability of Black bodies that many African Americans view the deaths of Trayvon Martin, John Crawford, Michael Brown, and the numerous other Black men who were gunned down by police in the United States this year. And it's within this historical context that today's discussion takes place. Let me introduce you to our extremely talented group of panelists. We have decided to forego lengthy introductions to provide additional time for conversation. Detailed bios can be found in the written program. I'll introduce these individuals in the order in which they will be speaking. Professor Carla Holloway is the James B. Duke Professor of English at Duke University. She also holds an appointment at Duke Law and in the Women's Studies and African American Studies departments at Duke. Melvin Tucker is a former FBI agent and former chief of police in Hickory and Asheville, North Carolina. Daryl Atkinson is an attorney at the Southern Coalition for Social Justice, where he is doing cutting-edge work on criminal justice reform. And last but not least, Professor Mark Anthony Neal Mann is a professor of Black popular culture in the Department of African and African American Studies, and he is the founding director of the Center for the Arts, Digital Culture, and Entrepreneurship at Duke. He is also the always stimulating and provocative host of Left of Black, and if you haven't seen it, I would suggest that you tune in. Without further ado, Professor Holloway.
Thank you, Professor Jones, and thanks especially to Liz Wangu and the students who make up BALSA, and for all of you for being in the audience this afternoon. It's a critically important topic, and I am really pleased that BALSA pulled it together in this provocative way. Part of me wants to say what she said, because the history that Professor Jones just gave is a history that I think we all need to be very aware of as operating in our contemporary political and cultural spheres. But I do want to speak towards that history. Badges and incidents. Our founding fathers had not thought these to be police badges, but in 2014 they are. They had not imagined them as incidents of brutality conducted by the very offices and officers designed by executive authority to protect citizens from brutalities and rage, to serve citizens as executors and protectors of their legal rights. They had not thought of these within the language of Section 2 of the 13th Amendment that gives Congress the power to enforce Section 1's ban on slavery and involuntary servitude, and the wake directly produced from these structural facts of America's history. Badges and incidents is a phrase with a certain aesthetic appeal, as well as a legal history. It has the potential reach of a history evident in judicial opinions prior to the amendment, and that indicates its incidental language is meant to mark, intended to be the badge of consequential acts directly related to enslavement. How might Ferguson's policed state be seen within the context of this language? Certainly, given the state's history of its primary residents, the population statistics would argue they have been targeted in a way that groups them into a category of persons once enslaved. And in this regard, the conduct of the state towards this particular group is reasonable constitutional terrain for us to interrogate. But instead of focusing on those whose ancestors were once enslaved, I suggest we focus on how that isolation into a category does not just make that particular group vulnerable, but in that place especially has created and arguably reinforced another population historically sutured to bad acts. Police misconduct is intimately related to police perception of the populations they encounter. Who deserves protection and who merits brutal discipline has a history. The badges aren't supposed to create the incidents, they are to mitigate against them. But from Dred Scott to Celia, a slave, to Henry Gordon, whom Professor Jones referenced, who bled after being beaten in 2009 by 4 police officers, and it resulted for him in a charge of destruction of property when his bleeding bled onto the police officer's uniform. That police officer is now on the Ferguson City Commission. And to this summer's death of Mike Brown, there is a pattern. From those back in the day events to this contemporary one, a Gordian knot chokes the executive branch of the city, a municipality whose economic infrastructure literally and absolutely depends on the anticipation of extraordinary levies and fines against Black citizens who are ensnared in a well-practiced web of economic brutality produced by white privilege and sustained by a system of checks and balances that makes certain the receiving end of the incidents are composed by those who wear the badges. Here is where we confound or at least emblematize or problematize the 13th Amendment's protections. When the badges of slavery are worn by 21st century officers, when the incidents that trace their generation to enslavement are reproduced by officers of the state to the extent that we can absolutely produce the statistical probabilities of how, on being Black and living in, for example, Ferguson, Missouri, will compose a set of incidents that render Black folk vulnerable to police brutality before it exposes them to their public service and protection. In fact, their service is rendered as marked in the city's commercial transactions, with patterns of brutality being the most publicly cognizable, of disparate and traumatizing mistreatment being the most publicly consistent, and the subsequent chill of civic action like voting or procedural claims against misconduct being the reasonable expectation. This is a familiar pattern in urban areas across this country. When someone asks a victim of domestic violence, why did she stay? We know the more appropriate question is, why did they hit? When someone asks a victim of police brutality, why not file legal complaints? Why not afford oneself of the protections of legal procedure? The more appropriate question is, why is brutality rather than service normative? At this moment, given our history and contemporary culture, the bodies of Black and brown persons suffer the state's suspicions rather than its interests. Because our attention in this incident began in Missouri, it is worth remembering the case just mentioned by Melissa Harris Perry, the 1857 Dred Scott decision. Chief Justice Roger Taney phrased the question this way before the Supreme Court. Can a Negro whose ancestors were imported into this country and sold as slaves become a member of a political community formed and brought into existence by the Constitution of the United States, and as such become entitled to all the rights and privileges and immunities guaranteed by that instrument to the citizens? And then Taney answers this question by declaring that Scott is a slave and not a citizen. Although the 13th and 14th Amendments followed that decision and effectively overturned it, it seems the question of badges and incidents is still a cognizable question of conduct and citizenship. The legal question of Dred Scott v. Sanford seems to have survived in a color-coded legal conduct. Recall its language. Black Americans had, quote, no rights which the white man was bound to respect, end of quote. Brutality as normative structure is alive and well in Ferguson and beyond, assured by white privilege and perhaps perversely enabled by a culture that makes race matter. Thank you.
Okay, I'm Mel Tucker, and I retired as Chief of Police in Tallahassee after 15 years there, in addition to the 2 departments I had in North Carolina. Last Monday, a week ago today, I was testifying in a trial in Columbia, South Carolina, in which a deputy sheriff, all on videotape, used a baton, an expandable baton, 30 times on a suspect's legs, causing a compound fracture of his legs, all on videotape. The deputy was Black. The person he beat was Black. Yesterday, I spent a good part of my day looking at 3 videotapes, different angles, of a shooting case in Alabama in which a police officer shot a 25-year-old student who was nude, obviously unarmed, shot and killed him. The officer is Black, the student was white. Some of you may presume to think what this guy would tell you as a white, older man, police chief, primarily policing in the South, and you'd be wrong. I would say to you that the shooting death of Michael Brown has focused the national attention onto police shootings, and by God, it needs to be focused on police shootings. More than that, it needs to be focused on police use of force, non-deadly also. Why? Well, because I've observed over the last 18 years that I've been serving as a litigation consultant and testifying in trials around the country, 520 cases on police use of force in different jurisdictions, that police officers are rejecting the use of non-deadly weapons even when they can use them with very little risk to themselves, and instead are choosing to take what we in the law enforcement profession call preemptive action and using their sidearms. Preemptive action is taking action once a threat has been recognized, but before the threat can be carried out. When these officers take this preemptive action, they are all too often making poor threat assessments, which results in them making big mistakes. when they do make mistakes, they are all too often not being held accountable by prosecutors, they are not being held accountable by their employing agencies, and they are not being held accountable by civil juries when they're sued. In addition, this should be of significance to you as law students, future lawyers, they are being supported, in my opinion, when they make mistakes by the case law on police use of force. I think police officers are rejecting the use of non-deadly weapons, and what I'm talking about there are like tasers, pepper spray, that's batons, and taking preemptive action because of what I think is unreasonable fear. That unreasonable fear can be racial fear, it can be cultural fear, or it can just be plain fear of physical harm. Racial fear I classify as obviously unreasonable because it's the product of prejudice, which is normally the result of a lack of personal contact with a particular racial group. Cultural fear is a little different because the officer may be of the same ethnic group that he's fearful of. An example would be a black officer who was raised in a quiet, low-crime, middle-class neighborhood that is afraid when he's policing in a high-crime, low-income neighborhood with social attitudes dissimilar to those of his own. It can be argued that fear of physical harm is unreasonable because policing is certainly not the most dangerous job around. The Bureau of Labor Statistics reported that in 2012, policing ranked 10th in the nation. There was fishing first, logging second, piloting airplanes, farming, mining, roofing, garbage collecting, and truck driving are all more dangerous than being a police officer. Why then are police officers why are they so afraid? I think it's because police officers are being fed a steady diet of by use of force trainers that they can be killed at any moment on the job. It all started when a lieutenant in Salt Lake City, Utah, came out in 1983 with an article that said, you can be stabbed by someone rushing you with a knife from 21 foot away before you can draw your weapon and respond. A professor at the University of Minnesota, Bill Lewinsky, has been studying it ever since then. He has found that the average officer takes 1.5 seconds to perceive a threat, draw his weapon, and fire. He found that it takes 0.23 seconds for a suspect with a weapon in his waistband to draw and fire. So any officer, knowing that, is going to say, I need to take preemptive action if I intend to stay alive. Cases like People versus Morales support the need for this preemptive action. In Morales, the court says the perceived danger must be only apparent, not real, not actual, to justify the use of deadly force. If a police officer waits till he sees the glint of steel, it's too late to take safety precautions. Other cases like Plakas versus Drinsky, the court stated that an officer does not have to use a less intrusive method if deadly force is justified. So therefore, officers use deadly force. Example of what I'm talking about happened just 3 days after Michael Brown's death and only 3 miles away from where Michael Brown was killed. And that was the case involving Kazim Powell. Some of you may have seen that video on TV. The 2 officers who responded to the call were white from Metropolitan Police Department out there. Powell's black. It was reported he was shoplifting. The police officers responded. The chief of police came on TV that night and said, we're not like Ferguson. By gosh, my officer said that he was charging at them with a knife in a raised position, and when he was 3 feet away, they shot him. The next day, a videotape surfaced that showed something completely different. He's walking with his hands at his side. I saw it. He was about 15 foot away when the officers opened fire. Then the chief came out and said, we shot at him. We shot and killed him because he was within 21 feet. He was shot even though there were 2 officers present. They both had tasers, and one of them could have acted as a cover officer, in other words, had his firearm out, and while the other one attempted to taser to take that person into custody without the use of deadly force. When deadly force is used, instead of the taser? Is it because of racial fear, cultural fear, or physical harm? I will not opine on why those officers shot Mr. Powell, but I will opine that it was unreasonable for them to have any physical harm since the last police officer killed in Missouri from being stabbed was in 1946. Sure, a suspect armed with a knife can kill an officer. Over the last 100 years, 1% of all the deaths have been from stabbing of all officers. 1% have been from slipping and falling on the job. 4% have been from contracting a disease on the job. So you can do your own math on that. You're 4 times as likely to die as a cop from a disease you catch on the job as you are from being stabbed. I know that officers are not being held accountable. David Klinger, a professor at the University of Missouri, shot and killed a man in 1981. He's now a professor now at the University of Missouri, and he reports that only 2% of all police shootings is the officer held accountable. Albuquerque, New Mexico, the U.S. Department of Justice just looked at their department and came back and said out of the last 20 shooting deaths out there, the majority were unconstitutional. I testified personally in a trial in Kentucky in which the suspect was a black man, 60 years of age, drunk, hands cuffed behind his back. 2 white police officers. The black man reached into his back pocket and came out with a wallpaper knife. Wallpaper knife, a little plastic knife with a little blade on the end that you can use to snap off. They shot him 12 times. The jury came back and said that it was justifiable. Was it because the jury was 9 white women and 3 white men, or was it because it was Officer Memorial Month and every officer that came in had a black band around his badge, or was it because an officer had been killed a week before the trial? I don't know, but that's what they did. Let me tell you this real quickly because it looks like I'll be running out of time. I researched all officer deaths in Missouri for 171 years. Here's what I found out. I found out that there was a police dog in Missouri called Caesar that was killed on September the 11th, 2007, when he was shot in the eye by a robbery suspect. See, a dog. It's absolutely amazing to me that we can find out when a police dog was killed, but we can't find out how many citizens and the circumstances involved when citizens are shot to death by the police unless they're one of that category of justifiable homicides. We don't know anything about the race of shooting officers or how many people and what race were killed that were not justifiable homicides. Let me close by making this statement. I believe that the shooting death of Michael Brown did focus some attention on police shootings, and that's good. I believe that police use deadly force all too often when it's not necessary and disproportionately against young black males. The question is, do they do that out of decisions based on race, culture, or physical harm? In 1990, Congress passed the Jeannie Cleary Act. That required universities like Duke to collect data on crime on campus and disseminate it. We need a similar law for law enforcement. Congress needs to act to require law enforcement to gather data and publish it on police use of force at all levels, including giving the race of the officers and the suspects. Finally, in the meantime, I think one of the things we can do, and that is try to make sure that our police departments reflect the demographics of the community they serve, and that way we can minimize at least the risk of decisions being made on the basis of race, gender, national origin, or at least minimize the discrimination in policing. Thank you.
It is awesome to be with you all today and look at the turnout at a student organization event. That is incredible. I really appreciate, I'm Darrell Atkinson. I'm an attorney at the Southern Coalition for Social Justice. I lead up our criminal justice reform work. We are seeking to end mass incarceration and the war on drugs. Big, audacious goal, right? And we're going to have that done by the end of the year. I really appreciate the comments by Professor Holloway and Jones kind of framing the broader historical context of how a Ferguson, Missouri can happen. because Ferguson, Missouri doesn't happen without really appreciating the context of state-sanctioned violence against black and brown people since the inception of this country. And we need to understand that, because we always want to hit the reset button when these issues happen and act as if this is the first time that it's happened. But when you understand this in a longer historical arc, I think it makes much more sense. In addition, I would submit that Ferguson can't happen outside of the context of mass incarceration, because mass incarceration now is the new form of caste. And I will take one point of exception, that the 13th Amendment prohibition of slavery, against slavery, has a huge exception clause. And people are familiar with that exception clause, except if you've been duly convicted of a crime, and then it's perfectly okay to enslave folks and control black and brown bodies, and we're seeing that right today in America. America has 5% of the world's population, but we have 25% of the world's prisoners. Either we're the most morally depraved nation on the globe, or we're doing something tragically wrong in our criminal justice system. When you look at that incarcerated population, it's disproportionately black and brown. Right now, 60% of the people held in a federal or a state prison are black or brown. So I would submit that Ferguson cannot happen without that state-sanctioned violence in the form of putting people in cages. There's a Ferguson near you. We don't have to go to Missouri to look for Ferguson. We've had three men of color killed in Durham in the past 16 months. And I want to call their names and bring those names into the room. Jesus Huerta, Jose Ocampo, and Derek Walker. All these men were men of color who were killed at the hands of the police. And I think we also need to understand the ingredients that create an atmosphere where a Ferguson can happen, where these men can be murdered and there be no public outcry. One, highly racialized stops and searches incident to stop. So for example, in Durham, African-American population is about 37%. They represent 83% who are searched incident to a routine traffic stop. That creates huge community distrust and huge community tension. Now, mind you, that's operating under the assumption that you're going to find contraband in vehicles driven by African-Americans more often than whites, but the hit rate is negligible. The hit rate for African-Americans is about 2%, for whites about 1%. So all of the over-searching on black folks isn't really yielding fruits that would justify that. Number two, the other ingredient that creates this kind of Ferguson kind of atmosphere is the highly racialized outcomes associated with the war on drugs. And let's look at marijuana, for example. African Americans right here in Durham are 3 to 4 times more likely to be arrested for misdemeanor possession of marijuana. Now, I'm sure you all know somebody, not that you all might have done it yourselves, but I'm sure you all know somebody who might have smoked marijuana. And studies show that people purchase marijuana, sell marijuana to people in their social network. And that's mainly drugs in general. So folks are offending at the same rates, but people are being arrested, convicted, and imprisoned at largely disproportionate rates. Ingredient number 3, the militarization of our police departments, associated with the federal burn JAG funding grant program at the federal level, as well as the DOD program. And so you have these highly militarized police forces. You know, people with their toys, they want to go use their toys, and they are using these in certain communities, not other communities. And so that breeds this air of tension and distrust between communities of color and police departments. So, you know, we have these concepts of equal protection, equal application of the laws, but we aren't seeing that right now in Durham. As I stated, you know, some of the stats with regards to searches and incident to traffic stops, and the main way that they're getting into cars is through consent, through verbal consent. So 60 to 70% of the searches are triggered through consent. Not that they have probable cause, not that they have reasonable articulable suspicion, that they're asking consent for people to search their vehicles. 75% of the people who they ask consent are black. Because once again, we're operating under the assumption that black folks have contraband in their cars more often. In Durham, African Americans are 9 times more likely to be in prison for a drug crime, even though usage rates for all illicit substances are relatively the same. So we have a problem in this country. We have a problem in our community, and the Ferguson-type events are just the match that lights the flame. So what can we do? I didn't come here just to talk about problems. I want to offer you some solutions. So for the past 16 months, a local coalition in Durham called Fostering Alternative Drug Enforcement. Because when you think about mass incarceration, the major engine, the animator behind our huge expansion of prison has been the drug war. In 1972, about 300,000 folks were in a state or federal prison. Right now, we got 1.5 million, another 700,000 in local county jails. So there's been this huge expansion around the war on drugs. So Fostering Alternative Drug Enforcement wants to shift the paradigm of the drug war, change it from a criminal justice paradigm more to a health and wellness, a public health paradigm. Because we're the only country on the globe that criminalizes people because they have a chronic illness, because they can't get well. So we have 5 recommendations that we have before the City Council right now. Mandatory written consent, because the intervention of having to fill out that written form will disincentivize people from giving up their constitutional rights. Moreover, it memorializes that the officer actually obtained consent and can, be used in court cases where that consent may be questionable. Make misdemeanor marijuana possession the lowest law enforcement priority. North Carolina, cities and counties don't have home rule, and I'm sure you all are familiar with the doctrine of preemption, so we can't preempt state law. But we can certainly incentivize our police department that we want these low-level drug arrests to be your lowest law enforcement priorities. We want you to go get the rapers and the murderers off the street. Mandatory racial equity training, because diversity is cool, but diversity doesn't equal equity. And so, it's been in the news that a lot of the talk about the lack of diversity with the Ferguson Police Department. But Durham's Police Department is very diverse. Chief is Puerto Rican. Command staff is very diverse with regards to the captains and sergeants. Our mayor is black. Our city council is majority black. But melanin in your skin doesn't give you the predisposition to a structural analysis. We have to understand that there are 4 levels of racism. Internalized depression, where you tend to believe the narrative of the majoritarian culture. Interpersonal racism, where an individual actor does something to another individual actor. Institutional racism in the form of our police departments producing these highly racialized outcomes. And structural racism when institutions interplay with one another. We need to judge systems by the outcomes that they produce. And I know that is very difficult for us as lawyers because we are wedded to this anachronistic and outdated concept of intent. We need to show that they had the intent. In no other discipline do we care about intent. We look at outcomes. So, for example, when we want to assess how well our economy is doing, we look at a number of economic indicators, NASDAQ, unemployment, GDP. And that tells us how well our economy is functioning. When we look at our criminal justice system, we have to look at the outcomes that it produces, not the intents of the law on the books. So if African Americans are being stopped, they're being searched, they're being prosecuted, they're being imprisoned at disproportionate rates, it's very difficult to say that our criminal justice system is operating in a racially neutral fashion. Mandatory racial equity training for all officers. We need to reform our civilian review board, because police need to be accountable not just to the city, but to the communities that they serve. And community members need to be on those civilian review boards so they can investigate the underlying merits of complaints. And lastly, we need to have mandatory data reporting for our police departments quarterly, where they're reporting on stops, searches, and the demographics associated with those stops, searches, arrests, and uses of force. So what can you do? Because as public speakers, and as litigators and as advocates, never have an audience and don't give them an action. The action that you can engage in Thursday, September 18th, is show up at the city council and let our city council know. Because see, when you leave the bubble of this campus, you back in the real world. Let our city council know that we need this panoply of interventions to begin to change the paradigm in Durham. Thank you for your time.
I was born and raised in New York City. As we think about a figure like Eric Garner in this conversation at the moment. And my memories of growing up in New York and policing, and more specifically the issue of aggressive policing. I think about the case of Abner Louima, who was in the custody of police custody in 1997 when he was sodomized by New York City police officers. The more famous case of Amadou Diallo, who was shot 41 times when his cell phone was mistaken as a weapon in a vestibule in the Bronx. New York City policing in particular, I think, is important to this larger conversation around Ferguson because of the policy that's been known as broken windows. That's where law enforcement agencies police on the smallest level, for the smallest infraction, for broken windows. The theory, which comes from James Q. Wilson and George L. Kelling, who William Bratton, the New York City police commissioner who instituted broken windows in New York City, calls a mentor. The idea that if you keep folks from vandalizing on a small level in their communities, you will keep that activity from being a gateway to more egregious forms of criminality. It's in this context that what we have witnessed is essentially the criminalizing of a generation of two, of black youth in particular, and also black men. And this goes hand in hand with a larger context where we talk about the legibility of black men in American society throughout the last 2 centuries, where black men are always already criminal, in need of containment. They're often viewed as a contagion. I'm thinking specifically of the case of Nashawn Williams, who was a young African-American man who was HIV infected, who infected a whole community of folks in Chautauqua County in western New York. The Opportunity Agenda in 2012 issued a report on how black men and boys are presented in mainstream popular culture and media. And they're often presented, as the report says, within the context of what we might call a problem frame. People who have to be taken care of, folks who have to be controlled. This, of course, has extended to what we see in law enforcement. In the context of thinking about the criminalizing of black youth and black masculinity, particularly in a city like New York in the 1980s, it also goes hand in hand with what folks might think of as the contagion of hip-hop and the hip-hop generation. A generation that notably was politicized by racial violence in Howard Beach in 1986, Bensonhurst in 1989. In fact, when they had the huge march for Eric Garner last month in New York City, it came exactly 25 years after the shooting death of Yusef Hawkins in Bensonhurst by a white mob. What we see that in terms of how that's extended in New York City, of course, are stop and frisk policies. And it also goes hand in hand with a form of policing that has gotten away from walking the beat. When I was growing up in the Bronx in New York City, you had cops who walked the beat. They walked the street. They knew the community. They knew folks in the community. Even if folks were involved in criminal behavior, they often had relationships with them that they could talk through. You can't do that if you're driving through a community in your car and have created these relationships in which folks are antagonized. There's no connection of humanity, if you will, if you're policing from inside your car as opposed to walking the beat. I also want to think about, when we talk about this broken windows policy, how we deal with marijuana, right? And as Dal said earlier, we know that you aren't folks who smoke a blunt from time to time. You might have friends who may engage in that kind of activity. But very often, for instance, what we hear from law enforcement is that marijuana use is a gateway to further addictions. It then becomes a gateway to criminalization, incarceration, right, as we think of in terms of the criminal justice narrative. Very often I don't think about that, and we don't think about that in terms of the actual science around that, right? And again, to think about how pervasive this narrative is, until like last week, you could be suspended in the NFL for smoking weed for a longer period of time than you would for engaging in forms of intimate partner violence. If anything, smoking weed is more likely a gateway to a 3-piece from Popeyes. On the issue of community accountability, one of the things I think has been a significant game changer has been the availability and access of handheld technology. If we go back to March of 1991 and the infamous George Holliday video, George Holliday was the young man who was looking outside his window playing with his new $2,000 video camera. He happened to put his camera outside his window and he saw a group of LAPD beating Rodney King, right? It was the first incident, right? Because what it was confirmation of the kind of brutality that we always knew existed, but suddenly we had a camera. In 2014, folks now have handheld videos. So you think about a song like Film the Police, which B. Dolan recorded in 2011. Of course, they're playing with the whole idea of fuck the police. But the idea that you have a citizen's right, and in fact, have a right to hold police accountable in ways in which you use your handheld technology to be able to capture law enforcement engagement with people and within our communities. It is no different than the policies that the Black Panther Party instituted way back in 1966, where they realized that it was within their legal rights to be able to oversee police officers and law enforcement engagement armed, as long as they had a 20-foot distance between those activities. And of course, California state law changed immediately when Black men showed up with guns monitoring police activities within Black communities. We now have the power to do that in terms of handheld technology. As I also think about modes of mobilization, in some ways, Mike Brown, like Trayvon Martin, were perfect victims. They were victims that we could invest futures in. Mike Brown was literally about to go to college. We all could imagine Trayvon Martin, the good middle-class Black kid who was going to go on to college. It's much difficult for us to make that same kind of investment in Pookie and Nene. Mm-hmm. Pookie and Nene might in fact be involved in nefarious activities within their communities, but they also don't need to be shot dead in the street, right, if they were not presenting a threat to law enforcement. And finally, so much of the narrative around police brutality and aggressive policing is framed around the spectacle of race. What that often obscures is that Black police officers are also invested in the power of the badge. Right? The color line is blue. It is not black or white in this conversation. And this is something, for instance, that John Singleton showed us in his very first film, Boys in the Hood, where the primary antagonistic police officer happened to be an African-American man. But spend some time doing a YouTube search on tasers and police taser attacks, and you'd be surprised how many white folks in this country get tased every day. When Body Count recorded the song Cop Killer in 1991, the song wasn't a threat because Black kids were listening to it. It was a thrash metal recording. Black kids weren't listening to it. The song was a threat because it was a song that disaffected white youth who also experienced police brutality were listening to. Right? It was a proverbial moment, for instance, when Martin Luther King decided that it was no longer simply a civil rights movement about Black folks, but a poor people's campaign, and became the context in which you could see Black and white folks working against a common goal. Police brutality and aggressive policing is another opportunity for us to engage in that kind of cross-racial activity. Thank you.
So I was directed to present questions to the panel, and I have questions, but in the interest of time, I think I'll open it up to the audience. Yes?
I have a quick question for the former police chief. So when you have cops that are getting all the rapid militarization that was mentioned earlier, where they're getting, MRAPs, et cetera, but you have OSHA on the other side, which says, well, if you don't use this equipment, or you're not trained for these emergency situations, and you don't use this equipment, you're going to get fined. $20,000 fine if you don't have your vest on you. How do you balance that using the equipment that was assigned to you, and then not going over using reasonable force because you have all this equipment?
Well, I think that part of the problem is we are not teaching officers to put into context what they're doing. I'll give you a perfect example of what I'm talking about. I'm working a case right now down in Florida, Palm Beach County, where a deputy pulled a young black male over who was riding a bicycle and talking on a cell phone at the same time, 8 o'clock in the morning, and the kid swerved out in traffic a little bit. So the deputy decided he was going to stop him for impeding traffic, broken window crap. You know, let me also say right now that about 95% of what was said here I agree with, every doggone bit of it. Now, this deputy stopped the guy, and it was all on video. And I've got some video stuff here I want to show you if you want to see it after a while. And it shows the kid putting the bicycle down after the blue light comes on. And then the deputy, as he parks his car, the kid gets out of the camera range for a minute. Then the next thing you see is the kid moving away from the deputy, walking fast, and then you hear bang, 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 and the kid's down, quadriplegic for the rest of his life. Why was he shot? Well, the deputy said it was because he was reaching in his back pocket, and it was like, he thought he was going to come out with a gun. That's that People versus Morales decision about taking preemptive action. However, in the context of that, what would make him think that a kid riding a bicycle had a gun in his back pocket, other than he's black? So, let me also say this. The deputy had just come back from a tour in Afghanistan. Let me tell you what this deputy was carrying. He had his bulletproof vest on, 76 rounds of extra ammunition for his Glock 40, 3 shotgun shells, deer slug for his shotgun that was in the trunk of the car, 5 sets of handcuffs, a taser, an expandable baton, oleoresin capsule and pepper spray, a pocket knife, a shotgun in the trunk, and a field rifle. Now, what do you think? Is that militarization? Is that looking at the citizen as a Taliban or a member of ISIS, or is that looking at him as an American citizen? That's what's wrong. It's absolutely terrible training going on in law enforcement today, and maybe some problems in recruiting people and not doing a good enough job on psychological evaluations in the recruited so we can weed out. This comment made about black officers beating people just like white officers, I found that to be the case. I really have. So we got a problem with it both beyond race, and it's part of it as a culture.
I just want to make a comment in response to that because Professor Neal brought it up as well. And this is a chance that we have to be critical and careful about arguments that begin with the cop was black and the victim was black. Just as Professor Neal said, the cop was blue. The culture, we can't ignore what the culture of policing does in terms of being able to go to work each day and fit into that particular community. So to set up an argument that is literally about race by attenuating it with the cop was black and the victim was black is a straw man argument. We have to be very careful of how we use race to critically interrogate moments that are racially motivated from issues that are motivated because of a hyper-militarized police that are taught to behave in a particular kind of way that supersedes any kind of community identity that they might have. So I'd just like to thank you for coming back to that comment and for Professor Neal speaking also to that importance of blue.
In addition, Professor Holloway, I would also add that it's further evidence that black folks internalize oppression.
Oh, absolutely.
And exercise that against other black folks. You know what I mean? By ingesting the dominant narrative on perceptions of threat, and we are all swimming in this dirty pond, irrespective of the amount of melanin that you might have or have not in your skin. So I just think it's really critical that we do this search and examination irrespective of who the perpetrator and the victim is.
Excuse me just a minute. We can't do that search until we get data. And we're not getting the data because the FBI is not collecting it. According to their spokesman, Mr. Carr, he said they're not going to do it because they don't have the money to do it unless they're directed to do it by Congress. We need to get something done about that. So we have data to analyze. We don't have it.
And we have to tell the truth about the data. The data that comes from the Detroit Police Department characterized homicides that were actually suicides, So when state policing is required to report to the federal government in order to be incentivized in a particular kind of way, they skew the data. So we not only need data, but we need truthful data.
The back.
Thank you. I had a concern also about how we characterize not only the perpetrators, but what happens as a result of the crimes. And you see, regardless of whether or not it's black on black, white on black, or white on white, you see a disparity in terms of the punishment. So I was interested in your thoughts about that and how that's reflected. And also, what do you think the impact of this new characterization of America as being in post-racial? How is that impacting our understanding of crime against black men and our perceptions of black men as you characterize them as being criminals?
So with regards to some of the sentencing disparities and the jurisprudence around holding folks accountable who murder people in the streets, and I would agree with Mr. Tucker's comment, is that the jurisprudence and the legal structure is built to maintain that kind of social control and invest that power in departments. Mm-hmm. So at the state level, you have public official immunity that you have to pierce, then you have to pierce sovereign immunity to ultimately be able to get to the department. The legal threshold to ultimately prove wrongful death is such an uphill battle, and so the jurisprudence is not even set up to hold folks accountable. But I want to take a step back for a moment and say that we should approach this from a broader frame, a frame that black and brown people have been fighting for since we landed on these shores in 1619, to be fundamentally looked at as human beings. Fundamentally. Because when that larger cultural battle, that enlarging the we of who this we the people is, at one time it was very narrow, it was white male property owners. And this whole fight in this country, the various fights in this country, have been about enlarging who that we is. So if we can fight that broader cultural battle, the rules and the policies that we put in place will obviously make sense. And I'll give you case in point. Let's look at the LGBTQ community, right? So when those folks, one of their major strategy into attaining their rights was that we're going to come out of the closet. We're going to say who we are. We're people. We're your community members. We go to church with you. We're in the daycare center, to fundamentally shift the balance that you see them as people. And once that fundamental terrain was shifted, of course the legal rules that you put in place to govern the actions between these group of people are going to make sense. Of course they should get married. Of course they should inherit for one another. Of course they should make medical decisions for one another. So we fundamentally in this country have not shifted the terrain where we see black and brown folks as human beings. That's why this state-sanctioned violence can continue to occur.
I want to pick up and ask a question to the panel, because you were talking about legal impediments, right, to fair outcomes. We don't have enough data, but we have some data. So, Daryl, you were talking about the disproportionate stops of African Americans in Durham and incarceration rates. And the St. Louis Dispatch found that black Missourians were 66% more likely in 2003 to be stopped by the police. And there's other data collected by entities like Mother Jones. I wonder if you can comment on some of the underlying systems and structures that benefit from this disproportionate engagement of people of color with law enforcement. I recall reading over the weekend that the municipal court fines in Ferguson were the second highest source of revenue. So if you have disproportionate stops of people of color and poor people, and if these stops are resulting in substantial revenue, is that a structure, a system that is perpetuating disadvantage? And are there other structures and systems that one might interrogate? And finally, one other question to the panel. Is there a gender component to what's happening? We've been discussing black men who have been disproportionately stopped or gunned down. You could frame this issue as one of black and brown masculinity. Black men are something to be controlled, feared, shot, right? They are contagion, right? One could frame it in that sense. But my question is, are black women, black and brown women, disproportionately engaged with the criminal justice system? And would we be as likely to see the sort of protest that we saw in Ferguson if Mike Brown had been Michelle Brown? And I'm thinking about Marissa Alexander.
Let me
Either of
give
those
a
questions.
couple answers here first. Although it's nice to have all the statistical data you're talking about. I'm talking about Durham. I've got a case going against Fayetteville Police too right now where a black man beaten by a white officer. And you can't use statistical data to show that the force used was excessive because the courts are not going to accept that. You folks are here today, I assume, because you're interested in the issue of race and police use of force. And you're going to be lawyers. How many of you have looked at the legal grounds for police officers to use force under Tennessee v. Garner, the 1985 case that dealt with arrest and the use of deadly force, or Graham v. Connor, the 1989 case right here from Charlotte, North Carolina, so you understand what the standard is. If you read that, you'll find out that the law is so much in favor of the police. And the Graham v. Connor case in particular talks about the totality of the circumstances to consider known to the officer and taking into consideration the fact that he has to make that decision in a split second as to what level of force to use in tense and rapidly evolving circumstances. You can't get a law stronger than that. And it doesn't allow pre-seizure events, meaning that you can't say, well, they shot 26 people there and they thought 30. The judge is going to say, as they've said to me, we only deal with this case, not those. You need to read the law and change it, because I think there's a lot of need for change in the law that gives the support for the officers in the force that they do use. Now, in terms of women, and I'll be real quick, there's very few black women in policing, number one. In fact, there's only 17% of all the policing in the United States are women. I have worked cases where police officers have shot and killed unarmed men, and it was ruled justifiable. Louisiana, a white female officer, 5'2", 203 pounds, shot a man who was rushing her, who was 6'4" and 240 pounds. I said she should have used her baton. She got on the stand. She said, I saw him. I looked at me. I said, there's no way he can take my gun from me and kill me. Boom, like that. The jury came back and said, that's okay.
Okay, so I think that we'll have to interrogate the prison industrial complex in maybe round two of this panel, and we'll also have to talk about gender issues. And I wasn't necessarily focusing on the number of women as officers, but the number of women as the persons who are being arrested and stopped. Right?
And therefore, these women who are mothers can't pay their fines, and then they are fined doubly or set up with arrest warrants because of child care issues.
Exactly. So clearly there's a need for a part two. Liz, did you want to say something before we end?
So I just wanted to thank the incredible panelists. Thank you so much for all your insight, and thank you so much for being here. And then thank you to the BALSA Exec Board and to the Center on Law, Race, and Politics for co-sponsoring this incredible event. I wish we had more time for Q&A, but we did circulate a list of recommended videos and reads that the BALSA Exec Board just thought would be insightful. So if you just want to look at those and maybe think about some of the topics that we've talked about today. And on behalf of BALSA, thank you all so much for coming. It was really important for us to have this conversation with the law school community and all the other graduate programs that also attended. So thank you so much for coming. And again, thank you so much to our incredible panelists.